Well, hello, scholars. Welcome to part two. And part two is really a is really a structure to help us problem solve. And we've kind of broken it down into four steps. Sometimes when we look at these problems in statistics, they seem overwhelming, and we kind of need a great a way to sort of organize our thinking. And especially on the AP exam, that you'll see this as well. And so in order to get full credit for any free response question, communication is really the key. And so what we've done here, and you'll see this in your book as well, is that we've really focused on the four different kind of steps that we need to do to communicate what you're actually doing. So we use state, plan, do, conclude to help us do that. So I'm going to walk through just the example that we did from the first part of activity 2, and then just talk about what are the steps that you would need to communicate. And then later on we'll practice this, and we'll see this happen quite a bit. So when we're talking about the question, we're going to use the question of the sample of 34 immigrants from the registries. So the way you'll see this phrasing is construct and interpret a 95% confidence interval for the true proportion of Madrid's recent immigrants who are identified as male. So this is going to construct and interpret is going to cue you in to say, I need to kind of follow these four steps of inference, in other words, decision making, to do that. So the state part is to talk about the parameter and the level of confidence that you're going to take a look at. And so this can be done in a sentence, and it's really just we are estimating the true proportion of really all Madrid's recent immigrants who identify as male, which is, again, we're doing proportion at 95% confidence. So really the state part is to describe what are we actually going to estimate here. So when we plan, we want to think of the inference method we're going to use, and then the conditions that are necessary in order to do that. Now, in this case, we're going to calculate what we call a one sample Z interval for proportions. And again, we'll talk about specifically why that name is there. One sample Z interval, we're using the normal distribution. It's one sample from a population, and we're doing a confidence interval. So that's why we use that name for it. Now, let's think of the conditions. This is only going to be true if certain conditions are met, right? And remember why we actually check conditions. In order for us to be able to think that our interval actually follows this method, is knowing that the conditions are actually modeled this way. So in order to know that it's a normal distribution, remember it needs to be large enough counts in that. And when we look at the center, right, we need to know that the sample was randomly selected, so that we know that we have an unbiased center, that it's going to be on target. And then the 10% condition is, again, about sampling without replacement. If you're taking samples and not replacing them, the population should be big enough that the probability really isn't going to change, or that the variation isn't going to change as we go through them. So what do you have to do on paper when you check conditions? So you do need to list them. So the random condition, you'd need to state that, yes, there's a random sample of 34 immigrants, check. The 10% condition, right, is we need to know that the sample size is small compared to the population in this case, or you could reverse it and say, is it reasonable to think that there's more than 340, 10 times the sample size? And it is, right? And so that's a check as well. And then the large counts condition is what allows us to know that the normal model is actually an approximately normal distribution, right? So we'd have to check n times p. Now notice that we don't we have to check the sample percentage in this case. So, 34 times 44%, that's clearly greater than 10. And then, 1 minus that is about 56%, and that's going to be greater than 10 as well. So those three conditions need to be checked, because the next thing you're going to do is you're going to base a lot of your calculations based off the normal curve, based off of the center being at the, at the mean, and so forth. So you really need to have those conditions there in order to do that. Speaking of do, the next step is the calculation. Now, again, we typically like to write at least the part of the formula on there. And I'll show you a calculator operation, because the one sample Z interval for proportions, we actually call it a I think on your calculator it's a 1 proportion Z interval. That is a way that we can do this calculation as well. But at least the formula, the generic formula, is fine, and even the numbers plugged in would be great to see. But more importantly, the interval, right? That's what we want for that, and you can write it in this form, or you can put it in the interval form here. So really, when we're looking at this kind of step, we're looking for, did you give me the formula? Did you plug in some of the numbers? And then ultimately, did you get the correct interval? And again, I'll show you some calculator shortcuts for that a little bit later. So the last part is conclusion, right? So we stated what we were going to do. We planned it out. We calculated it. Now we have to conclude. So again, this structure that I gave you before about, we are 95% confident that the interval captures the true proportion of Madrid immigrants who are male. Again, I'm looking for context. I'm looking for the interval. We're looking for, or did you say how confident you were? And is it clear to me that you are actually talking about all Madrid immigrants, not just the sample? So that's why we say the true proportion. I might even add in the true proportion of all Madrid immigrants who were male. So again, you can see that on the paper, you're going to kind of have these 4 parts, and some people actually like to kind of divide their paper into 4 pieces, with, like just make 4 boxes. And that way they can kind of organize their information. And you'll see that in free response questions quite often, where they just basically ask you the question and then they give you basically a blank page for you to come up with this. So we're not going to walk you through it on the test. This is something that we're going to practice over and over again. So then the second part of this, our question is, use the interval to evaluate whether the validity of these leaders' claim that 60% of the immigrants are male. And so again, we might have talked about this, but the idea here is it plausible that 60% is the actual number? Well, let's base it off of the interval, right? If we look at this interval, clearly it's inside the interval that we think the true proportion could be. So clearly, then it's plausible, right? We don't have any evidence to say that their claim is false, right? Now, if it fell outside the interval, then we might have some evidence to say that that's not true. But in this case, we don't really have any evidence to say, well, we can't say that 60% isn't the number. It possibly could be. Right? Okay, so that's kind of the idea of the 4-step process and what we see with that, and how we work that out. So you'll see that in a few examples, not only on Sapling, but in our study guide as well.